Hello everyone, I'm Lindsay from Happy Hour Stitches, and thank you so much for joining me today as we sew block 3 of the Happy Hour Stitches block of the month together. So in this video, I'll be sharing my best tips for making this block, as well as some products I love that make the process easier. Now before we dive in, let me explain the block of the month a little bit for those who are just starting this journey with us. So this block of the month is free to my email subscribers for a limited time. So if you're not already signed up, make sure you click the link in the video description to sign up. And then each month in 2025, you'll receive a free block sent straight to your email, as well as the setting and the finishing instructions later this year. It's just such a fun way to connect with other quilters and just prioritize joyful sewing time each month. So here's block 3, March's block. So make sure you check your email for this block pattern and get all of the resources about this block of the month, including fabric requirements and more, at the blog and the link in the video description. So it's going to be such a fun year of sewing, so let's get started on block 3. I have all my pieces for block 3 cut out, organized by color and size. I've also given everything a really good press, and I've used this flatter spray by Soak, which is a non-starch smoothing spray, so it gets rid of all my wrinkles, and it really makes these fabrics crisp so they're easier to sew and cut. So all my fabrics are prepped. And we're gonna start by making our half square triangles using our medium-sized squares. So let's prepare for that. So we're gonna start by marking diagonal lines from corner to corner on our lighter squares. And I'm gonna show you a few different methods to do that. So the traditional method is to turn your square right side down, align your ruler from corner to corner, and then just use a pencil or a marking tool of your choice to mark that line. That's the traditional way. One of my favorite ways is to use a Hera marker, which is a tool, a plastic tool that just has like a little, sharper edge on it. And so similar to how we drew a diagonal line with a pencil, we'll align our ruler from corner to corner. And then I'll just use this tool to press down, just like I'm kind of rotary cutting, and it leaves this nice little crease indent. So that's a Hera marker. This is a great method because it does not leave permanent marks. Another method I like to do is I will just fold my square in half, and I will just give it a little finger press. And you still get that nice little crease. I like this method because it doesn't require any tools. I can do it while I'm sitting down at my sewing machine, and it's just as effective. Now, this last one is helpful if you do not like drawing a diagonal line and sewing on a 1/4 inch on both sides. Sometimes that can be hard to get that really accurate 1/4 inch seam. So what you can actually do when you're making half square triangles is, instead of saving that cutting on the diagonal line for last, you can just cut it in half right away. And then I'll do the same thing with the pieces I'm gonna sew it to. So I'll take my other square, cut it in half, and then I can just align these and just sew with a 1/4 inch, and I get the same effect of the half square triangle, and you're just eliminating the marking step completely. So I'm just cutting, and then I will use the lines on my sewing machine to sew that 1/4 inch. So this is actually one of my favorite methods when I'm making half square triangles. So let's bring these pieces over to our machine and start sewing. Another secret weapon for sewing diagonal lines or 1/4 inch on diagonal lines is this diagonal seam tape from Cluck Cluck Sew. I love this. You basically just stick it on the bed of your machine with the red line aligned with your needle, so that is sewing straight. And then these black lines on either side are a 1/4 inch away from your needle. So you can use those to sew half square triangles or any sort of diagonal lines you need to. Now, these are the triangles I already cut. So I'm just gonna sew 1/4 inch on these. But if I have a marked line down the center and I need to sew 1/4 inch away from that marked line, I will actually align that marked line with one of the black lines, which is my 1/4 inch. And then I'll do the same thing down the other side. And there we have it, 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the diagonal line. So isn't that easy? So if you haven't already, we are going to trim our triangles apart on the diagonal line we've drawn, because we need to make 8 total of these. So we're just gonna trim them on those diagonal lines. And then these are actually slightly oversized. So we will trim these down to be the correct size we need, which is 2.5 inches. And I'm gonna show you a tool I love to do that. So I like to use these Clearly Perfect slotted trimmers, which they have, it actually comes with 2 different rulers to do 1/2 inch sizes and full inch sizes. So we are going to be trimming to this 2.5 inch line. So what you do is you align this dotted line with your seam line here. And then this is your 1/4 inch seam allowance, which you can see I have. So you can see it's just a little bit oversized. So I'm gonna I like to use a 28mm ruler for this because it's smaller pieces. I'm just gonna trim on both sides. And then this actually has little slots so that you can trim your dog ears off the corners. So now this is an accurate size. Press it open and it should be the exact right size I need. So I'm gonna do this for all of my 1/2 square triangles here. This is one of my favorite tools. I usually oversize my 1/2 square triangles and trim them down because that just gets me much more accurate results. And that little extra time it takes to do it really pays off in the long run. Now we're going to be pressing our 1/2 square triangles open and pressing toward the darker or this orange side. I like to press all my units from the front, and I like to set my seam first, which means I just take my iron and I put it right on top of that stitching line, and this gets it warm and it lets those threads sink into the fabric so that when I press my triangle open, I get a really flat and crisp and straight diagonal seam. I'm just going to repeat this with all of my units. Next, we're going to be making our flying geese units. So we're going to add the squares to each corner of these rectangles to make flying geese units. So I've already shared all my favorite tips for marking diagonal lines on the back of your squares, but I wanted to showcase this cutting tip one more time because you can actually use it with more than just 1/2 square triangles. You can use it on any stitch and flip unit like flying geese. So I'm going to position my square on the corner of one of my rectangles, just like how I'd sew it. Now, normally I'd have this diagonal line, I would sew on the line and trim it, but you can actually cut it now. So we're actually going to line up our 1/4 inch marks on our ruler with the corners because we want to sew a 1/4 inch on the diagonal line. So we don't want to cut on the diagonal line because then when we sew, we'll be into our seam. So I'm lining up 1/4 inch mark with the diagonal line and I'm just cutting. And now I can just take this to my machine and sew, and my 1/4 inch will sew perfectly corner to corner. So you can do this with any unit, and I think it makes it easier sometimes to get that accurate 1/4 inch seam because you can align this edge with lines on your machine to get it really accurate. Okay, so if I choose to cut my pieces, I will sew with a 1/4 inch down this line. But otherwise, I would just mark my pieces as usual, or I will use the lines on my diagonal seam tape to make it even more easy for me. I'm aligning corner to corner on this center red line. And just a tip, when I am sewing flying geese, I always like to start sewing from the middle center instead of the point, because then my machine doesn't eat my points like it sometimes does, or pull it under. It sews really smoothly. If you did not cut on your marked line, you're going to want to trim a 1/4 inch seam outside those marked lines. So we will do that now. Sometimes the good rule of thumb to just finger press this triangle open to make sure it covers everything you'll be cutting off. That way you can make sure it's accurate. If not, you still have time to rip the seam out and re-sew if you need to before you trim, but this one looks perfect. We will be pressing this open. So just like we did with the half square triangles, I will set the seam by pressing on top of the thread, and then from the front, in one smooth motion, I will just press open, make it a nice straight diagonal line on my pieces. I love this Olesio mini iron. I mean, it's very cute, but also I love that it has this light on it so I can see accurately. It has this nice little point on it, which just helps kind of get those nice pressing, and it helps direct the fabric so I don't have to get my fingers in there. And green is my favorite color, so I could not resist. Now we're going to sew a second square to the other side of this rectangle, right sides together. Now I always tell you to sew from the middle to the point to have smooth sewing, but now we have a seam here and some bulk in the fabric, so we're going to start sewing at the point. But to make sure that my machine does not eat my pieces, I'm just using a little scrap piece of fabric. That's what I trimmed off from our flying geese unit. So I'm going to start sewing on that and then start sewing right onto my piece. And this will just help my machine sew smoothly. So I love to chain piece my units, and one of my favorite tools is this thread cutter. It actually uses, this is an old rotary cutter blade I have that's in there, and it's really cute. It just sits on my workspace, and I can use this to just trim apart all of my units, the threads in between, and now I will trim on the 1/4 inch line and then press these squares open. Now that we have our half square triangles and our flying geese done, we are going to use these to make our side units for block 3. So I'm going to take a flying geese unit and then 2 half square triangles on the side, and I'm going to lay them like this. You should get this nice little W shape with your seams, with your darker fabrics facing down. And then I'm just going to sew these together, and I'm going to make 4 of these, 1 for each side. So my side unit is sewn together, and now we're going to press toward our half square triangles. So you can see we're starting to get a little bulk where all of these seams are coming together. And the best way to deal with bulk is with your pressing and the tools you use. So I'm pressing on top of a wool cutting mat, and wool pressing mat, which is just laying on top of my ironing board. And wool pressing mats absorb heat. So when I'm pressing, it's like I'm pressing with heat from the top through my iron and then through the bottom from the wool. So I get a really flat seam that way. So I like to press my units from the top. So I'm just going to press toward those half square triangles. Now, if these seams were being a little stubborn, I might spray them with, I just have some distilled water in here. I don't like to use water in my iron because I've had leaking problems in the past. So if I was having some stubborn seams, I might spray it with a little water and then press on top. But now I'm going to actually set this under a wooden clapper I have. This is just kind of like a weight that sits on top of your pieces, and it kind of pushes them down while they cool. So I'm going to just set that one there while I press my next side unit. I'm just going to layer things under here. They can go on top of each other. The last step to making block 3 is to make the center unit, which is a basic 4-patch unit. So I'm layering my large squares down. I have the lighter squares opposite each other and then the darker squares opposite each other. I will sew these together, and then I will sew those pairs together to make the center. So I've sewn my pairs together and I've pressed towards the darker fabrics on both pairs. And now I can sew them together. Now because I pressed in opposite directions, my seams will nest like this, which is going to help that center line up in my 4-patch. So you could put a pin in there if you want, but I try to avoid pinning when I can. And here's our center unit. Here is our center unit. Now we're going to lay out our side units so that the flying geese always point outward or away from the center. And then we have our remaining squares. We just lay in our corners here. Our block is almost done. So we're going to sew all of these together in rows. So I'm going to sew these, and then these down here, and then I'm going to sew the rows together to finish the block. Back to pressing, we're going to press toward these edge squares, and then on our centerpiece we're actually going to press toward the center unit so that we're not pressing toward all this bulk on those side units. And because I can, I'm just going to stick this under my clapper. Now normally I do like to press from the front, but when you're pressing in to a block, that's sometimes hard. So I'm gonna press from the back on this one, just to make sure all of my seams are pressing the right way, not twisting anything. A lot of seams on those side units. Okay, now we're gonna sew all the rows together, and how we pressed all of our seams should be nesting here. So we're just going to sew with a 1/4 inch. You can add pins there if you want. And we're almost done with our block. One last press for our block. We're going to press these rows into the center. So again, I'm going to do that from the back, just to make sure I'm not pressing any seams away they shouldn't be. And once I'm done pressing, I will take this to my cutting board and just make sure it measures the correct size, trim a little bit if I need to, and our block 3 is done. And here's our finished block 3. It's such a fun one. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me. Thank you so much for sewing block 3 with me. I just love this block and I can't wait to see everyone's version. So make sure you're sharing it on social media. You can tag me at Happy Hour Stitches, or you can email me photos. I just love seeing everyone's progress. And of course, make sure to check out the video description for links to the blog post that has details about this block of the month, as well as links to all the products I showcased today. I wanted to give a quick shout out to the quilt top you see behind me. Just finished this quilt today. It is my new quilt pattern. It's called Out of the Box. It's available on my website, h8stitches.com. And if that block looks familiar, it's because it's a variation of block 1 that we made for this block of the month. So if you are a subscriber to the email list, you would have gotten this in your inbox for free. But if you missed out, you can pick it up in my shop. I'm going to be finishing it this summer during our Summer of Finishes challenge that I'll be hosting. So stay tuned for that. So thank you all so much for joining me today as we sewed block 3. I will see everyone next month for block 4. And I just appreciate you spending time with me for this little happy hour of sewing time.